convened by the Industrial Development Corporation, the IDC, together with Anglo American, the Minerals Council of South Africa, the African Climate Foundation, as well as the PCC. The session will unpack various threads of how it is that we can go about developing a critical minerals beneficiation strategy for the continent. My name is Pamela Mondliwa. I'm from the IDC, and with me today I have an esteemed panel of decision makers. Now, I don't say that lightly, because this speaks to the kind of conversation that I'd like us to have. We are decision makers, and therefore we can move the needle forward in terms of how we go about developing the strategy. We have from the upstream mining industry, Themba Mkhwanazi, who's the Regional Director of Africa and Australia at Anglo American. This is a sizable player in mining on the continent, accounting for about 15%, my numbers may be slightly old, but about 15% of mining production on the continent. We have online, they'll bring up shortly, Mzila Mthenjane, CEO of the Minerals Council of South Africa. He represents approximately 75 mining companies. Then from the automotive industry, one of the demand pathways for critical minerals, we have Andrew Kirby, who is the president and CEO of Toyota South Africa. Then from finance, we've got Joanne Bate, Chief Operations Officer at the Industrial Development Corporation. And this is the development finance institution that's been charged with supporting industrial development in South Africa as well as the rest of Africa. Then last but certainly not least, we've got someone from the research community. We have Musa Mabuza, CEO of the Council for Geosciences, which is mandated to promote research and provide specialized geosciences solutions for the industry. Please give the panel a welcoming applause. So just before we get started, just some housekeeping rules. We're going to try to keep the panel discussion to about 40 minutes so that we have an opportunity to engage with the audience as well. So when it is time to have Q&A from the audience, please briefly introduce yourself, name and affiliation only, and then ask a brief question, the operative word being brief, please. And now I think we can get started. And by way of maybe some background so we can contextualize this discussion, the energy transition presents opportunities to catalyze growth for the African continent. By concurrently investing in upstream mining, critical minerals industry, in midstream and downstream opportunities in refining, and battery production as just one of the demand pathways examples. This is an opportunity that the continent can leverage for growth. Critical minerals really underpin energy systems and are also a key input into modern technology as well as communication systems. Just by way of example, power grids are a source of demand for copper and aluminium, while electric vehicles are a driver of demand in battery minerals such as lithium, manganese, cobalt, etc. So this is an important conversation for us as a continent, and it's very important that as the leaders in these various aspects of the ecosystem, we're able to drive a discussion and co-develop a strategy that can allow us to realize this opportunity. Without further ado, I'm going to start the first question, and Themba, I'm going to start with you. Africa's critical mineral endowments and base capabilities, because they are there as much as we don't talk about them too much, offer an opportunity for participation in high-growth critical minerals global value chains. How can African countries leverage this opportunity to produce and export beneficiated goods? And how is Anglo in particular thinking about playing in that space?
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you, Pamela, and good afternoon to everybody here and whoever might be on the streaming. It's a really important question, Pamela. And I think for me, it probably starts with how African countries define their strategies in relation to critical minerals. And as you quite rightly say, I mean, of the 260, elements or minerals, 80% of them, are from the developing world, of which obviously Africa counts to a large proportion of that. So, I'm of the view that says, first of all, let's be clear about what does critical minerals mean for Africa. because it tends to be a Western bias in the sense that it's very much focused on the needs of the developed North, right? And they have defined it as critical to their manufacturing industries, critical to obviously their national security, and critical to their decarbonization imperatives. Now, our view would be to say that word needs to be more inclusive. And I think maybe the appropriate word should be transition minerals. Because when you think about transition minerals, you just don't think about the criticality of that element, which is very downstream in nature. You start to also appreciate that the pathway to decarbonization, there has to be three elements. And for us as Anglo-American, we see this as three global trends. The first one being electrification of energy, mobility, and transportation systems. And that's where the bulk of the conversation around critical minerals is at. But there's another element, which is the fact that the developing world or the global south, there's a pull for better living standards. So infrastructure is just as key because the developed south wants to also enjoy, the living standards of the developed north. So, minerals such as iron ore, coal, and diamonds and all that also start to continue to play. And then the third element has to be the fact that this global south, populations are going to grow by 2 billion by 2050. And hence, therefore, food security starts to become an issue. And hence, therefore, access to arable land, organic fertilizers, start to play a key and pivotal role. Now, for us as Anglo-American, we're very well positioned because if you look at our portfolio, including, fertilizers, we have an exciting product called Poly4. We are very much well matched to that. But what we say and what we would argue is to say, let's have a holistic approach to critical minerals, transition away from critical to something more inclusive, which is transition, and ensure then that we also cater for all of these other elements. And my last point is to say, why do I say it's downstream focus? Well, it's downstream focus because it expects the global south to pivot away from fossil fuels without appreciating that you've got to pay for the transition in order for it to be just, which is why it cannot just be downstream. You've also got to look at it from an upstream nature and also a midstream nature as well.
Thank you for that. I think there are a lot of very interesting threads of that conversation that I'd like to pick up again. But let's give the other panelists an opportunity to weigh in first before we have any follow-up questions. Mzila, I'd like to come to you. What role is the Minerals Council playing in shaping critical mineral strategy for South Africa, seeing that you are based in South Africa?
Pamela, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for having me. And I think a great question, and I really like the response that Themba has provided. And as you mentioned, we represent about 70 odd members in South Africa, including Anglo-American. And as such, we could not have played a secondary or even a tertiary role in as far as the driving of the country's critical mineral strategy. So we actually have been quite involved with the development of a framework quite recently, which is a basis and a starting point that's going to be informing the country's critical mineral strategy. And that's something we have been doing very closely with the DMRE, including some of its agencies, such as the Council for Geosciences, MINTEC. That framework was then presented to a broader group of stakeholders, because one of the things that we've had to consider is that this is not merely a mining issue, but it's an economic development issue. And so a holistic approach, and from Themba's response, looking at a global and a continental perspective, from a South African perspective, it's really how we see mining broadly, but more specifically the opportunities lying ahead with critical minerals in as far as the impact and impetus to South Africa's economy.
Thank you for that. I think that's, I really like the emphasis on the holistic approach to this, and this is something that I'd like to come back to discuss with the panelists a little bit later. I'd like to bring Andrew into the conversation, and I think as one of the many pathways, demand pathways for critical minerals, and I think perhaps for your industry, battery development perhaps provides the biggest opportunity for value addition within the automotive global value chain. And if the automotive industry in South Africa, just as an example, were to reduce carbon emissions, that also includes shortening, the logistics of the value chain. So how is the automotive industry interacting with the mining industry to try and find each other on how, this value chain could be developed?
Thank you, Pamela, and good afternoon to everyone. Yeah, I think that's obviously the crux of the matter. Just on a personal note, this is fairly interesting for me because I started my career in the mining industry as well. So it'd be nice if we can have a better way of bringing the mining sector and the automotive sector to more closely be able to drive industrialization on the continent. We've got a very good example. In the early 1990s, there was a catalytic converter strategy where there was a clear policy in South Africa to beneficiate catalytic converter production, beneficiate the PGMs to be able to make catalytic converters commercially and economically viable. And within 5 to 10 years, we spurred a 35 billion rand a year industry. So the belief is that we should be really thinking about how strategically find ways of adding value to those critical minerals. And for us, those are obviously minerals that are embodied in battery manufacturing, as you mentioned, by creating some form of royalty mechanism, some form of fund that can then be reinvested into value addition processes. If we continue along the lines of just exporting the raw materials, we're going to end up in the same situation as we are with many of the endowed minerals that we have on the continent. So I think there's tremendous opportunity for us to work together for the mining sector that, especially in Southern Africa, essentially has all the minerals we need to be able to produce battery electric vehicles and obviously the associated batteries, to then be able to work with companies that can add processing, etc., value creation, so we can be competitive globally. That's the high-level concept.
I like the example of something that we've seen before. I think catalytic converters are the top automotive component export from South Africa, and they are currently at risk because of the transition. So we really need to think about how do we replace value addition within the economy in order to, at a minimum, sustain the levels of GDP output, but hopefully to also leverage it for growth. Joanne, I just want to bring you into the discussion and to try to see if, from the IDC's perspective, you can elucidate how the thinking is around how one would go about building a strategy for mineral beneficiation in the region, on the continent, and also if you could touch a little bit on what the IDC is doing specifically to realize that opportunity.
Great, thanks. And thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon in what is, I think, a very interesting and, dare I say, critical conversation on the continent. So from an IDC perspective, we were pursuing two pathways, one being green hydrogen, the other being new energy vehicles. And what we saw in that pursuit of critical pathways is that there was significant overlap between the value chains. And wanting to produce batteries in the country in order to attract OEMs into battery electric vehicles is an ambition, but not necessarily an objective. So we then needed to unpack what is the opportunity within the value chain that we can unlock, not just for battery vehicles, but for storage purposes as well. As a region, and this is not just a South African play, this is a regional play. As a region, we're sitting on a significant proportion of the critical minerals, and I like the transition metals suggestion, because they are about transitioning the economy. And with those minerals that we have in our region, we can choose to develop the way we did in the past and watch the exports leave the country and not create the multipliers from the jobs, or we can actually identify through the value chain what the next logical step of production is that we can home base within South Africa in order to build that value chain. So we are currently invested in a number of projects from early exploration all the way through to precursor material production in order to unpack that value chain and determine where optimally to invest. We very clearly mapped it. We brought a specialist on board to assist us with thinking about the battery minerals value chain. And we're now moving into a stage of enablement to look at how do we ensure the right level of investment at different stages in the life cycle, but also how do we partner with others? I mean, I always say the IDC, we can take risk, we're involved in project development, so we'll get involved from a very early stage. But we have a balance sheet that is a rand balance sheet, whereas these investments are dollar investments. So we really need the scale of capital that is greater than the IDC can do alone. So we really are looking at and for partners to work with us in unlocking this value chain. And as we think about these transition metals, it really is also thinking about how do we find the right inclusive ownership models and participation models. This is not just about an ambition to have mines. It's a case of how do we understand the skills necessary in order to have the right volume and value of skills to both build the mines, mine the mines efficiently, and put in place the manufacturing pathways that are necessary. The opportunity that is presented to us as a country is the opportunity to create short, green, efficient value chains to feed into the global value chains of the OEMs and storage, battery storage suppliers.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think it's really good to hear what specifically you've done and what it is that you are hoping to achieve. We are hoping to achieve in this regard. I'm excluding myself here. Musa, I think you bring in or you represent a different part of the ecosystem which is sometimes kept out of these conversations, which is around research. So of the geoscience solutions that you provide, how is that supporting this development of a regional critical minerals value chain?
Thank you, Madam Program Director. Good afternoon to the panelists and delegates. So I argue that it all starts with geosciences. In fact, at the Council for Geoscience, we say that geoscience is the foundation for human development. And why do we say that? We say that because you cannot begin to talk about critical minerals and development of critical mineral strategies, whether at the national level, regional level, or continental level, until you have made a determination of what it is that you have. And I think we often talk loosely about having abundance of minerals in the continent. But how abundant is abundant? And does it warrant us to even sit and develop a strategy on the basis of which we have not made a determination of what it is that we have? Now, we can make certain extrapolations sufficient with information that is available to us is sufficient to do that, but in parallel, I think there is a big challenge that our country and the continent faces, and that is investment in geosciences in particular. I do a comparative analysis of what is the nation's investment in geosciences per square kilometer. You take OECD countries, on average, they invest $65. In Africa, it's less than US dollars a square kilometer. Now, if you are, as a nation, as a continent, investing less than US dollars a square kilometer, then you have absolutely no knowledge of what you have. And it makes it very difficult to develop a proper strategy. So an investment in quality geoscience solutions and data will go a long way in helping us to make a determination, a proper development of a strategy. I worry sometimes about the number of strategies that we develop as a country. And I argue that if we were to grow our economy on the back of strategies, we'll be the fastest growing economy in the world. Our biggest challenge is in the execution of the strategy. I draw from the approach of the Europeans. The European Union as a bloc develops the critical mineral strategy, not as countries, as a bloc. And how do they use the critical mineral strategy to secure what is of best interest to them, as my brother Temba elegantly articulated? That informs their foreign policy disposition. So the choices that they make, who they talk to, and how they talk to them, to us, is informed by the strategy that has clearly delineated what it is that they need, how much of it, and where they're going to get it. It informs their research investment. So where do we put our money to research on what, so that we don't spread our limited resources too widely, but we must concentrate our resources in order to have focused research to achieve the things that we need to achieve. It informs how they will secure the supply of the minerals that they need, and so on and so forth. So I want to argue that a fragmented Africa on this critical minerals development strategy may very well be detrimental for the African continent. I think we need to think about an African approach. What we call them, for me, is neither here nor there. We have called them strategic minerals, we call them critical minerals, we call them transition minerals, call them whatever. But what are they critical for? And I think that's the question that Mr. Mkwanazi asked. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Musa. I think that's a very good contribution to the discussion. So in this first round of questions, we've heard a few things. First, emphasis on a holistic approach with the proposal around transition minerals. Then there's emphasis on collaboration between various stakeholders in order to realize this opportunity. And then a clear message that we've done this before in terms of platinum to catalytic converters. And then lastly, we've heard around it's less important about strategies and more around execution. How this all comes together for me is that we may not all move at the same time, because we're a continent of 54 countries. It would take a long time to get all of us to agree on everything. But it's very critical that the movers that are willing to go forward are able to identify opportunities and move forward with those. We've spoken a little bit about the critical minerals to battery production value chain, but there are other pathways. So from your perspectives as industry players and stakeholders, what are these value chains that we could move on to and quite quickly?
Great question. I think in your summary, the one that I would add as well is a point that Andrew made that said, as we think about the strategies, focusing in on the execution, as my brother has said, let's also realize that the relationships need to be different, because the relationships between the global south and the global north have been one of extractive. The relationships must also be to obviously beneficiate, and create these value chains. So you ask, what are the opportunities? And I agree with the point that Mr. Mabuza made around regional, Africa-type strategies. Southern Africa sits on a huge potential to be what I would coin a significant player in green energy, right? In fact, Southern Africa, and in parts South Africa largely, could be what the UAE is in oil and gas. That's the significance of the endowment in terms of wind, some of the highest wind speeds, in the world in terms of solar. So when we start to think about this and we start to think about the potential for cross-border collaboration in terms of hydrogen, and then we start to think about, okay, well, if you produce the electricity through solar and wind and you convert that into hydrogen, you start to think about potential downstream options. You could consider the manufacture of green steel as an example. You could consider, what we are quite heavily involved in as well, which are very much the hydrogen valley nodes, right? Because you start to think about mobility and you start to think about heavy haulage. We produce platinum group metals. They currently, as Toyota was saying, play a role in catalytic converters. You have the fuel cell, right? A fuel cell vehicle, which, for us, we would argue is better than a battery electrical vehicle in that you can charge a fuel cell vehicle within minutes, just like you do with diesel using hydrogen. So you start to think about those potential value chains. You also start to think about potential value chains for producing green methanol, which can be exported or even used locally. So it's, I'm just highlighting, a few examples, but you can start to see that from that primary industry, you can start to influence downstream industries which can benefit from that. So it's huge. Obviously, there's quite a number of things that have to come right for that potential to be realized, but that potential exists.
Musa, would you like to weigh in on the same question?
Sure. Thank you, Madam. So I think certainly the regional approach is the best approach. And I do think that where we have the greatest opportunity is to build on what already exists. I also like the example of catalytic converters. So there are things that we know and we have done. And in fact, I learned recently and I was reminded that South Africans created a vehicle called Jules in the 1990s. It won all manner of international awards and recognition as an electric vehicle. And it came back home and we kind of forgot about it and we did other things. And those young researchers and not so young who were involved emigrated to the US. And a few years later, in comes Tesla. And I'm thinking, could this be a coincidence? I'm not saying anything, though, but it could very well be a coincidence. But I'm saying the potential is there. I think reorganization of relations within the country between business, industry, financing as a great starting point to take advantage of the lowest hanging fruits, and we know them. And the redefinition of relationships between the global south and the global north, I couldn't agree more. I moot for what is called integrated value chain development. I don't think that it will be sustainable for us to say and think that as South Africa we can just take all the minerals, beneficiate everything, and only export final products. I think that ambition is excessively ambitious. But I think that if we, in redefinition of our relations between the global south and the global north, delineation of integration of value chains and a shift from pit to port to integrated value chain development will be the greatest value proposition I will put across. Thank you.
I'll allow it this time.
I just wanted to quickly say that. So in Germany, we have about 200 hydrogen vehicles.
Yes.
We partnered with Toyota.
Yeah.
It's Uber vehicles that are driving around
Yes.
carrying people. We've just recently signed an agreement with BMW in South Africa on X5. Again, hydrogen fuels. So the vehicles
It's
do
moving.
exist, right?
Yes.
It's just recently creating that platform. Sorry,
Yes.
thank you.
No, thank you. I
moderator.
think that's a
Important.
useful example of further illustrations that these things are happening.
Yes.
There are questions around how do we scale up from the individual examples that we are able to talk about. Mzila, I'd like to pose the next question to you, which is taking up the opportunities in the upstream mining of critical minerals can't be business as usual. So how is the South African industry, which you represent, performing in terms of environmental, social, and governance best practices? And what do you think are the priorities, if there's still gaps, in order to fill those gaps?
No, thanks, Pamela, for that. I think one of the things we must bear in mind is that the conversation on critical minerals, in my view, is an additive conversation. For a country that has been mining for over 100 years, we have actually some of the best established mining practices from technology. If you look at the technology in South Africa's deep level mining, coal mining, and I think I would dare to say that even when it comes to ESG, South Africa as a whole, given where we've started with governance, is leading in the country, in the world, and has given a lot of input to some of the global standards. And mining companies, when you look at a lot of the rankings, are amongst the top 20, if not, I'll stretch it a bit and maybe say top 50. So first and foremost, let's accept that mining is very disruptive. I think firstly, if you talk from an environmental perspective, you actually have to move the earth in order to be able to get the minerals out the ground. But there's rehabilitation, both on a concurrent basis as well as post-mining, which is conducted by mining. We have relationship with the DMRE in terms of making sure that there's sufficient provisions for that rehabilitation to take place. And more recently, we've seen as well, when it comes to water, which is another critical issue, and I'd imagine a key debate in this COP, from a reuse of water and water conservation, as we've been experiencing huge droughts. But interestingly, the mining industry is actually amongst the lowest users of water when you compare it to many other industries. But there's been a lot of examples where mining companies have actually embarked on recycling of water to ensure that the use of potable water in the operations is minimized, and what is used more broadly is largely industrialized water. And what that does is that it provides for more potable water to be available to community and society. The other important thing I'd like to emphasize from a ESG perspective is around energy efficiency, which is the flip side of carbon efficiency. And this is talking largely to scope 1 and scope 2. We've seen significant progress in as far as mining companies, and Themba has just mentioned some of them around what they've been doing on the on hydrogen, and they've gone as far as developing the truck. We've seen the country, as well as it moves to renewables, how a lot of mining companies have signed up to be able to install renewable energy sources for their mines. I think out of the 12 watts of renewable energy planned for the country, the mining industry probably has planned for at least half of that. And then from a social perspective, what I need to emphasize perhaps two things. The first and foremost is on safety and health. We cannot compromise the safety and health of employees, whether we're producing minerals today, or in the future. And I think we'll see how technology will enable us to do that as we have less and less people working in dangerous places, which mining is, and we certainly accept that. But mining will continue through remote systems. And that technology is also going to be providing for a lot more inclusivity in terms of involvement of women. There's less physical labor required, but more use of technology. And we're seeing a lot of that in terms of a lot of operational centers that are based on surface, but the mining is taking place underground. And then lastly, there was mention of a just transition. I think the mining industry has a huge role to play. And this is going to enable the mining industry to play a critical role from a food production and food security, given the amount of land that mining companies have. And on the other hand, I've spoken about recycling of water, and combine that with concurrent rehabilitation and post-mine rehabilitation. There's an opportunity to create new economies. And what that is going to do is ensure that communities that have been established during mining and supported through supply chain and procurement of mining companies actually continue to live in those areas rather than potentially creating a source of migration and immigration for those communities. And these are just some of the best practices that we've seen. There's always room for improvement, particularly on the safety side. And from a transformation in South Africa, we've seen the industry, out of 450,000 employees, about 75,000 are women. So the inclusion I think is in the right direction. And we've got a huge opportunity to collaborate much better as an industry around regional development in terms of communities. The current model of localized social and labor plans, I think it's beyond its sell-by date. The social challenges that we have to address are much bigger than any one company can address, or government can address. And so we really need to find ways of working better together for bigger and better social impact. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you, Mzila, for giving us, that background on ESG. Joanne, and then I think also linked to Andrew, but I'll ask a specific question to you, Andrew. The development of the battery value chain is a key feature of the JET IP, particularly the NEV chapter. And so how important was the inclusion of that in JET IP and the implementation plan? And how does South Africa and the rest of the continent excuse me, leverage that to be able to secure funding for these value chains?
So to me, the inclusion was absolutely critical. When we started with the political declaration at COP26, I think it was, at that stage, NEVs were included as a just transition pathway to ensure that we didn't lose the South African automotive industry, given the transition out of ICE vehicles. But what we saw was a far greater opportunity for decarbonization of transport, as well as building the critical minerals value chain. So this pathway presents an enormous opportunity for inclusive ownership, as well as job creation, in the provinces where it matters most. So, the Highveld developed on the back of gold. So if you look at where the critical minerals are located, you can only imagine the potential for employment and manufacturing hubs that exists in the Northern Cape and other regions. So it was a critical just transition play to ensure that we both protected an industry that exists, and justice to me is far more than 100,000 coal workers. We're in a country with enormous inequality and joblessness. So we can't think about transitioning the economy, not the energy system. We can't think about transitioning the economy without ensuring that we create meaningful work for people where they are. And I think that's what I find, I always seem to quote Anglo, but the living mine approach, it is about how do you create communities that have sustainable industries and livelihoods that mine for a brief period of the longevity of those communities. So mines need to be what communities do as an aside, while they actually are building a flourishing community. And I think just to pick up on the point on the jewel, I think what is, because we've been looking at the jewel lately and PBMR, and the big difference. So the analysis of Tesla versus jewel, somebody was prepared to throw capital at Tesla and make sure it was successful. So how do we think differently about deploying risk capital to unlock the investment opportunity? This isn't a safe and cautious approach. This has to be a proper risk-based development approach to ensure that the development happens. It's not going to happen without risk, but it is a bet worth taking to ensure that the country and the region grabs their rightful place in dominating in this critical sector.
Thank you for that input. Andrew, I mean, one of the critical elements of successfully developing a value chain is in part about sufficient demand for the end product that comes, at the end of the line. In terms of the automotive sector, not Toyota specifically, but collectively, is there any thinking that or discussions that you're having internally around some sort of standardization to some degree of the kind of battery recipes is the wrong word, but that's all that's coming to my mind. Various combinations of critical minerals for the particular battery type that are produced, which would, together with energy storage, support sufficient demand to make such investments in the value chain commercial.
No, unfortunately not. And this is what makes, I think, the situation fairly complex and certainly affected Joule, which eventually I think perhaps was a bit ahead of its time. But the battery technology we have today is a far cry from what was available 10, 15 years ago. And I've already been exposed to what Toyota is doing globally, and I can see the steps that are being taken every 2 years for the next six years. So all of the OEMs around the world are heavily investing in trying to find solutions for the cost, the range, the charging capacity to make this viable. Because, of course, there are bans in the UK, bans in Europe, there's legislation in the US, in China. So it's forcing a massive transition. And for the South African automotive industry, it's an existential crisis for us, right? Do we survive into the future or not? Because we're so heavily reliant on exports. So, and unfortunately, I think we're still going through a number of innovation steps, and we haven't really reached a level of maturity where we're starting to see that basically chemistry, where we're starting to see that chemistry start to be confined just to a few different options. The options are actually really varied. And just to give you an idea, we're even looking as Toyota globally at solid state batteries, which again is a completely different chemistry. There's chemistry using salt as a medium, for example, along with lithium, etc. So we're in this phase where if I were to invest in a battery manufacturing facility right now, number one, it would cost me around $1 billion US. I'd need to produce over 200,000 units for it to be viable, but I'd be locked into that fixed piece price for the next 10 years. So at what point do we start to invest? How do we do that? How do we create the scale for the continent, and do that in a way where it's really viable, and we don't end up having to fund it and make losses in the during that period. So I'm presenting a fairly complex situation. It is complex, it is challenging, but we need to just take small steps to eventually get to that point.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I think you're highlighting the complexities from the demand side, and I think Themba highlighted some of the complexities at the upstream level. And thank you for clarifying. The word I needed was chemistries, not recipes. Before I come back to the panelists, I'd like to invite the audience to ask some particular questions. I don't think it's every day that you get access to such an esteemed panel. So if we can have a roaming mic, we'll take 3 questions, do a response, and then we'll see if we have got time to take another round of questions. There's 2 hands there towards the back.
My name is Claude Kabemba. I work for the Southern Africa Resource Watch. I just want to thank you, the panelists. I think they all said the right things. I think they're giving hope, ambition. But this is conversation we had in the 60s. The Nyereres, the Kaundas, the Lumumbas, they fought for us to maintain our resources here and transform them. In 2009, the AU put in place the African Mining Vision. It has been years and years today. That vision has never been implemented. So I want to ask you, what convinced you that you'll do, or what you are saying will happen? What are the threats that you are seeing, both in terms of leadership, in terms of thinking, in terms of skills, in terms of finances, that we are going to achieve what you are saying? Because people are suffering. The poverty is so huge. We want to find solution, practical. The DRC and Zambia have put up a collaboration, cooperation, to put in place manufacturing, which will lead to EVs batteries. I don't hear that in this conversation. And we are saying we need a regional one, a continental one. But there's something tangible the DRC and Zambia are doing, and you are not referring to that. How are we going to bring that? But the European have succeeded because people can move from one place to another. Here, even the movement of people on the African continent is a problem. The movement skills is a problem. How are we going to do all this? No country has a policy on critical minerals, including South Africa. So how do we integrate? How do we harmonize? I think we are looking at practicality of these things. We've been talking about this thing for decades now. Thank you.
Thank you. There was another hand that side.
Good afternoon. I'm Christabel from Southern Africa Trust. My question is on the opportunity that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area provides, I think in the context of this conversation, as we're talking about value addition, and we have a lot of opportunity through regional integration and the various regional economic communities that are there, that we are members of. How do we utilize that and use the opportunity that is there in terms of the trade, in terms of adding values? How do we work with other countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have another taker of a question? There might not be a second round. Okay. I think that's the... So we have two questions. One is on what are the capabilities, be it financial, be it new strategic opportunities, or new avenues that we are seeing now that allows us to realize this opportunity that we have more broadly been talking about for decades as a continent. Then the second question is, how do we leverage opportunities such as the ACFTA to, again, realize this opportunity? I will be open to whoever would like to respond. Please respond to one and not both questions. Joanne?
I was going to respond to both. I think maybe just to say from an IDC perspective, because I think that your points are very well made, and I think that the ambition for Africa has become a dirty word, and potential, because Africa's got such great potential. We've got ambition as a continent, but how do we take those steps that actually allow us to realize the vision and the opportunity? And that's where, from an IDC perspective, we put this critical minerals strategy together. But there's two pieces. We launched a paper last night, which is transitioning to green industrialization, which is very much looking at how do we create the manufacturing pathways that create the multipliers in economies that are going to leverage the regional value chains and create the jobs in the value chains on the continent with partners on the continent. The Africa Free Trade Agreement is obviously a really important opportunity for us, being part of so our shareholder is the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. And Minister Patel sees the Africa Free Trade opportunity as a significant opportunity for the region and for the country. So we also, as the IDC, are part of the development finance institutions of the region, and we're looking at how those regional value chains can also be unlocked through those partnerships. So we are one entity. I keep saying we are one entity, but we are committed to the development. We are wanting to work with like-minded partners. And I think it's really important that we identify the policy enablement that governments need to put in place to unlock the opportunity, but that we deeply encourage private sector to take the opportunity and run. I do believe that this is a private sector opportunity. I do believe that we need to find collaborative opportunities to support different ownership models to ensure that we have inclusive ownership as we unlock these opportunities. It's not just about foreign investors, even South African investors, coming in and owning, extracting, and creating value. It really is about the people on the ground actively working in the mines, in the manufacturing entities, and being part shareholders in that. So it really is, for me, about like-minded partners taking that first step together so we can point at what good looks like, as opposed to having a theory about what's possible.
Thank you for that, Joanne. Anyone wants to provide a second perspective? Andrew? Oh, I'll come back to you. Andrew, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I think there has been a lot of frustration because it's been many, many years of discussion about how we can beneficiate our minerals in Africa. I just want to give a very practical comment that I think can speak to both questions. But it's important when we think about the different value chains that we also think about who is the customer and what's the product. Otherwise, we lose the real opportunity to implement a clear strategy. And I think the automotive sector can be used as one of the value chains that we can use to kickstart the beneficiation of minerals, obviously creating growth and economic opportunities at the same time. The South African automotive industry exports 63% of our volume to Europe. We have the customer. Right now, it's the export markets that are prepared to pay for battery electric vehicles. We've got the production. We've got the products that are now being developed. Every year, new BEV products are now coming online, and they're more competitive, and we can now leverage that. The question is now we've got the product, we can manufacture it, we've got the capability. It's not difficult to manufacture a BEV. It's where do we source the components from? Now, to source a battery, we need to have something that's really competitive. And if we can have a beneficiation strategy within the regional context where the refining, the value addition can happen all over Southern Africa, all over Africa for that matter, feeding its way into battery manufacturing, we can then have the product and the customer. And why not be able to also share that within the continent? Right now, for us to export within countries is no better off than importing from India or China. That's wrong. So just a practical way which I think we can really use to kickstart this whole process.
Thank you, Andrew. Temba, you wanted to come in?
I was going to say we share your frustrations. But, we need to be positive. There is progress. I think for me, in addition to what Joanne and Andrew have said, let's also be mindful of the fact that this experiment in democracy in Africa is relatively new. I mean, if you think of the fact that Ghana, which was the first country to be independent, that was 1960. You compare that with Europe, right, which has been at this for hundreds and hundreds of years. I do think, though, that when we look at the new crop of leadership and you look at the focus and the things that are being said, whether you look at Kenya, you look at Namibia, you look at Zambia, you look at Botswana, and others, there is that realization that, you need to have an economy which is inclusive. You need to have an economy where the private sector plays quite a pivotal role. And I think in most of our economies, the public sector, obviously plays a greater role, particularly in key elements. Take, for example, South Africa. It makes up 45% of the economy. And that balance is not quite right. It needs to shift to perhaps something more closer to about 25%. And even more so, where you look at the key elements of where the public sector plays in terms of, logistics, energy, and all that. So more liberalization is required. Then you also look at some of the commitments that have been made in terms of growing the economies, moving forward with these aspects that we think about. And we're seeing that policy can have a dramatical impact. And I look at the example of South Africa, where, through the stroke of a pen, the legislation changed around self-generation of electricity. And in an example, this year alone, for example, 2023, South Africa has imported somewhere in the order of close to $1 billion of solar panels. That's equivalent to about 4.5 gigawatts of electrical energy. That's the size of one of our power stations, Medupe Okosile, that is now available through private capital. So yes, it's frustrating, but the direction is moving in the right direction, and the right noises and the right actions as well, because noise alone, is not enough. We need to see the action.
Thank you very much, Themba. I think we only have a few minutes left, so we're going to move towards closing statements by each of the panelists. And I'm going to go back to one of the first points that were made around a holistic approach. So in an ecosystem, there are various players, all with a... Oh, is someone's hand up? Oh, apologies, Msila. Do come in.
Yeah, no, I think the point that was made in terms of the questions is quite critical. And Themba has mentioned too what I think are some of the foundations that will actually see some of this regional cooperation and development taking place. And from a mining sector perspective, the Minerals Council is also a member and an active member of what we call the Mining Industry Association of Southern Africa. And these are bodies such as the Minerals Council in each of the SADC members that are that are members of MIASA. And these are some of the conversations that are taking place in terms of kind of regional perspective we need to have. What's been interesting in terms of response from a lot of African governments since this conversation on critical minerals has picked up momentum has actually been very similar responses of beneficiation and hoarding commodities, whereas actually the thinking and the critical thinking here should be about comparative advantage rather than one country wanting to be all things to the market, but look at what is the opportunity and the advantage that it has in as far as enabling the regional beneficiation of critical minerals, not just from a exporting, but also for own use. And so I think the conversation has started, and as Themba said in response, I think we certainly share the frustration, but I think I'm quite confident that the right conversations are taking place in the right places by the right people. It will take some time, but it certainly is coming our way. Or I should say we're actually going towards this ambition rather than waiting for it to come our way.
Thank you very much, Mzila. I think we have 5 minutes left, so we really do need to wrap up at this point. As a way of your closing remarks, and this is to the panelists, I'd like us to go back to the holistic approach. From the perspective of development economics, it has always been understood that development is messy and there isn't a clear path. And where we have seen really large strides in terms of development, what's happened is that there have been coalitions, and specifically development coalitions, where everyone comes in with skin in the game to say, I'll bring my money, I'll bring the minerals under my ground, I'll bring my skills and my capabilities. And together you can actually see some significant movement. One of the key challenges, and I think it's been alluded to in this conversation, is policymakers aren't always keeping up with everyone. But countries have been through this, and what they do is that they identify pockets of capabilities within the public sector and together leverage that to really be able to develop. So the question I'm asking to each of the panelists, and you all just have 1 minute, please, is going forward, in the next conversation that you have about this, because it's a series of conversations with the PCC, what is the thing that your organization is doing to move to the next level?
So we recognize that, we probably need 6 times the levels of minerals and metals in a decarbonized world than we do currently. But we also recognize, though, how we mine and how we fund that mining has to be in harmony with societal needs and also the needs on the environment. And we need to do that in a way that creates enduring value for all stakeholders, not just, the investors and the shareholders. And for us as a company, we believe that through our purpose of reimagining mining to improve people's lives, and through the frameworks of how we actually define how we do business through, for example, our future smart mining, our sustainable mine plan, which also, gives the appropriate focus on technological development and the social license to operate piece. That's how we are making a difference. And of course, one of the key things is collaboration. Yes. Very key.
Let's end on that to keep with the 1 minute. Joanne?
So I think Themba's said a lot of what I would have liked to have said, and I'm not very good at keeping to the script. So what came to mind while Themba was speaking is the other thing that we need and collaborative focus on is standards and I always want to say accreditation. So how do we ensure that we can cost effectively demonstrate best in practice mining and product within the value chains that we are creating? Because I think that creates both value and a competitive advantage for the country and the region in locking into those global supply chains.
Thank you. At least that was within a minute. Musa?
Thank you. Can I reiterate my understanding that the biggest challenge that faces us today is the supply gap of minerals and metals needed to meet the net zero target in 2050. If we don't get those minerals, and if we don't invest in getting those minerals, then this 2050 target for net zero is only theoretical. It will remain theoretical. So what are we doing? We have placed a lot of emphasis on partnerships. We have a partnership with the IDC. We have a partnership with Exaro and Sasol. This hasn't happened in a long time, that government moves towards partnership with the private sector. We're opening our arms and embracing the role of the private sector to leverage that strength. We are the permanent secretariat of the OAGS, the Organization of African Geological Surveys. We are mapping the country at the right scale so that we can begin to tell you where the minerals are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew?
Thank you. I think maybe just to build on a comment that Musa was making, I think the target's not just to get to net zero by 2050, it's to ensure that as an African continent, the value is not exported. So how do we use this challenge, this structural change, to create an opportunity for us to accelerate our transition to green manufacturing? I think that's the huge opportunity for us. And from a practical point of view, to answer your question, we're going to continue actively promoting and involving ourselves in furthering the African Continental Free Trade Area. We're working very closely with Jan and her team and the DTIC in terms of how do we structure the critical minerals policy. But also, I'll be lobbying my parent company for how do we put these investments into the continent and think from a regional perspective to really do things very differently. We don't want to take 10 to 15 years to create the European Union. We want to take just a few years to create an African Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Mzila?
Thanks, Pamela. So maybe just to finish off with a metaphor that in order to make a loud applause, you need both hands, right? And I think we've seen how business has really been willing and able to contribute to that. But we do need this other partner, which is government, in order to make an applause. And one of the things that we are doing very, very strongly as Minerals Council is continuing with policy advocacy. And the most important part of that is really advocacy to ensure that the industry continues to grow, particularly if you look at exploration. There's a need for much more exploration expenditure in South Africa, particularly enabled by a lot of other things, which Musa has spoken about in terms of geosciences solution. And Musa, here I will throw in the issue of the cadastral system for your benefit. But I think also an investor-friendly environment, and this particularly in as far as coherent and coordinated government functioning to make sure that really mining remains a primary industry that is growing, and we arrest the current decline in mining industry that we're seeing in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Mzila. I'd like to thank all the panelists for all your very useful insights and being open around where your organizations are. And now that you've told us what you will be doing next, if we are in an audience and you're speaking again, we will be asking, so what's the feedback? What's the update? What more illustrative examples over and above the ones that you've given today that you can share with us? Please join me in thanking the panel for a really, I think, useful discussion. We're out of time, and thank you very much to everyone here for your participation and the useful, interesting comments that added to the discussion. Thank you.